My parents gifted my sister a $28,000 European cruise for her birthday and tossed me a $5 lottery ticket as a joke. They told me to use it to pay off my rusty car. I ended up winning $120 million. By the time they realized what they had handed me, my phone was already showing 57 missed calls from them. Before I continue my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been treated like the family disappointment only to prove everyone wrong. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta, I learned very quickly that love was a transactional currency in our household. My parents, Vivian and Desmond, measured a person's worth strictly by their zip code, their designer labels, and their proximity to power. As an African American family that had fought hard to climb the social ladder, they were obsessed with maintaining a flawless image. My younger sister Monique understood this assignment perfectly. She was the golden child, the pageant queen, who married Preston, a white wealth manager at a top-tier corporate bank. Preston was arrogant, condescending, and brought the kind of generational wealth aesthetic my parents craved. They worshipped the ground he walked on. I was the exact opposite. My name is Cleo, and at 32 years old, I was the designated family scapegoat. I did not care about country clubs or socialite brunches. I worked as a forensic accountant, a job that required me to dive deep into financial records to uncover corporate fraud and embezzlement. I loved my job. I was brilliant at untangling webs of deceit, finding hidden assets, and holding corrupt executives accountable. But because my salary was modest and I drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, my family viewed me as an utter failure. Every holiday, every family gathering was an opportunity for them to remind me of my shortcomings. But nothing could have prepared me for the absolute humiliation they planned for our joint birthday dinner. The evening started at a notoriously exclusive steakhouse in downtown Atlanta. The air in the private dining room was thick with the smell of expensive cologne and roasted garlic. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table sipping my tap water while the rest of my family ordered bottles of imported wine. It was supposed to be a shared celebration for my 32nd birthday and Monique's 30th. But as usual, the spotlight was entirely on my sister. I watched in silence as my mother Vivian stood up and tapped her crystal glass with a silver spoon. She pulled a thick velvet envelope from her designer purse and slid it across the table toward Monique. "Happy birthday to our beautiful girl," my mother said, her voice echoing with pride. "Your father and I wanted to give you something truly special to mark this milestone. We have paid in full for a VIP European river cruise for you and Preston. $28,000 of pure luxury because you deserve the world." Monique shrieked with delight, snatching the envelope and throwing her arms around Preston's neck. "Oh my gosh, Mom, this is amazing," Monique squealed. Preston smirked, adjusting his tailored suit jacket. He looked around the table with that familiar look of superiority he always wore. "We will definitely send you postcards from the Mediterranean," he boasted, swirling his scotch. "It will be a nice break from the stress of managing other people's millions." I kept my face perfectly neutral. I was used to this. But then my father Desmond cleared his throat heavily. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He flicked his wrist, tossing the paper across the long table. It fluttered and slid, coming to a stop right next to my water glass. I looked down. It was a $5 Mega Millions Quick Pick lottery ticket purchased from a local gas station. "Happy birthday, Cleo." My father said, his tone completely flat, devoid of any warmth. "Here. Maybe you will win $20 and finally pay off that rusty Honda of yours. Your accounting salary clearly is not cutting it." A heavy silence fell over the room for a split second before Preston let out a loud, mocking laugh. He pointed his glass at me. "Careful." Desmond Preston chuckled, his voice dripping with condescension. "She might use the winnings to move out of that neighborhood of hers. My tires practically got stolen when we dropped her off last Thanksgiving. I would not want to take my car back to that part of town again." Monique giggled loudly, leaning into her husband. Mom just smiled warmly at the two of them, completely ignoring the blatant insult directed at her eldest daughter. No one defended me. No one told Preston his comment was out of line. To them, I was just a punchline, a cautionary tale of what happens when you do not marry for money. As a forensic accountant, I was trained to separate facts from emotions. The fact was, this family would never respect me. The fact was, they enjoyed keeping me around just to make themselves feel superior. I did not yell. I did not cry. I calmly opened my purse and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. I placed it on the crisp white tablecloth next to my glass. "That should cover my tap water and my share of the air in this room," I said, my voice steady and cold. I picked up the wrinkled lottery ticket and slid it into my pocket. I stood up and pushed my chair back. "Where do you think you are going?" my mother demanded, her fake smile dropping instantly. "We have not even ordered the birthday cake yet. You are embarrassing us, Cleo. Sit down." "I am going back to the neighborhood Preston is so terrified of," I replied evenly. "Enjoy your cruise." I turned my back on their shocked faces and walked out of the restaurant holding my head high. The drive back to my apartment was quiet. My old car rattled slightly on the highway, but it was mine. I had bought it with my own money earned from my own hard work. I unlocked the door to my modest apartment, dropped my keys on the kitchen counter, and let out a long breath. The apartment was small, but safe. I sat on my worn sofa and pulled the crumpled $5 ticket from my pocket. It was drawing night. I had never played the lottery in my life. The mathematical odds of winning were so astronomically low that my logical brain considered it a foolish tax on the desperate. But just for the sake of closure, a habit ingrained in me from years of auditing, I opened the lottery app on my phone to check the winning numbers. The numbers flashed across my bright screen. 0, 4, 19, 23, 25, 49, and the mega ball was 14. I smoothed out the wrinkled piece of paper my father had thrown at me like a piece of garbage. I looked at row A. The printed numbers read 0, 4, 19, 23, 25, 49, and 14. I blinked. My vision blurred for a second. I rubbed my eyes hard and looked again. I read the numbers aloud in the empty room, speaking slowly to ensure I was not hallucinating. 0, 4, 19, 23, 25, 49. Megaball 14. They matched perfectly. Every single number was an exact match. I checked the jackpot amount listed at the top of the app. $120 million. For a long, suspended moment, the only sound in the apartment was the low hum of my refrigerator. I did not jump up and down. I did not scream in joy. I did not call a friend to celebrate. My training as a forensic accountant immediately took over my nervous system. I knew exactly what $120 million represented. It was not just financial freedom. It was a massive, dangerous target painted squarely on my back. Wealth of this magnitude destroyed lives, ruined relationships, and attracted predators. And I knew exactly who the biggest predators in my life were: my own parents and my brother-in-law Preston. I knew exactly how the scenario would play out if I told them. My father would immediately claim ownership of the ticket, stating that he bought it with his money. Preston would aggressively demand to manage the funds, insisting that I was incapable of handling such wealth. My mother would expect me to fund their lavish country club lifestyle unconditionally. I needed to move fast, and I needed to move in absolute silence. I immediately powered down my personal cell phone. I took the device into my bedroom and tossed it into the back of my dresser drawer. I opened my encrypted work laptop and began researching the specific state lottery laws in Georgia. I needed to know my rights. I found exactly what I was looking for. Georgia law allowed lottery winners who won over $250,000 to claim their prizes completely anonymously. I could shield my identity from the public, from the press, and most importantly, from my family. But I needed an impenetrable legal fortress. First thing Monday morning, I drove to the financial district. I walked into the offices of the most ruthless and elite wealth protection law firm in Atlanta. I bypassed the standard reception desk and demanded an emergency consultation with their senior managing partner. Once the heavy oak doors of his office closed behind me, I slid the winning ticket across his desk. Within 48 hours, we established a completely anonymous blind trust. I named the entity Vanguard Holdings. The legal structure was ironclad and layered with multiple non-disclosure agreements, completely masking my identity as the sole beneficiary. The law firm handled the entire claim process, submitting the ticket to the lottery headquarters on my behalf. I opted for the lump sum payout. For the next 7 days, I lived as a ghost. I contacted my accounting firm from a secure email and requested immediate personal leave. I stayed inside my apartment ordering groceries online and reviewing the thick stacks of legal and tax documents my lawyer had couriered over. By Wednesday, the local news stations were buzzing with the massive announcement. A single quick pick ticket sold at a suburban gas station had won the $120 million Mega Millions jackpot. The news anchors laughed and joked on television, speculating about who the lucky mystery billionaire could be. I sat on my sofa, sipping black coffee, watching the screen with a calm, calculating focus. I was busy planning my next move. The money cleared the banking system on the 7th day. Exactly $67 million after federal and state taxes was successfully wired into the highly secure accounts managed by Vanguard Holdings. The transaction was complete. I was officially wealthy beyond anything my family could ever comprehend. I was untouchable. I sat at my small kitchen table holding my personal cell phone in my hands. The absolute silence of the past week had been peaceful, almost therapeutic, but I knew I could not hide forever. It was time to face the reality of my situation. I pressed my thumb against the power button and held it down. The screen glowed to life, displaying the manufacturer logo. As soon as the device connected to the cellular network, the phone practically exploded in my hand. It began to vibrate uncontrollably, sliding across the tabletop. Notifications flooded the screen in a rapid, relentless sequence. The sharp chimes of incoming text messages and voicemails echoed off the walls of my kitchen, overlapping into a chaotic noise. I watched the red notification badge on my phone icon climb higher and higher. 10 missed calls, 25 missed calls, 40 missed calls. When the frantic digital assault finally stopped, the screen displayed 57 missed calls. They were all from my mother, my father, Monique, and Preston. Dozens of furious, panicked text messages immediately followed. I opened the preview screen. "Where are you? Answer the damn phone, Cleo. We know about the money. Call Preston right now before we call the police. You cannot hide from us." My heart hammered against my ribs. How did they find out? The trust was anonymous. The claim was sealed. I was a forensic accountant. I had covered every digital footprint. Before I could even open a single voicemail to hear their voices, a heavy, violent pounding rattled my front door. The wood shuddered under the sheer force of the blows. "Open the door, Cleo!" My father roared from the hallway, his voice muffled but filled with rage. "We know you are in there. They had found me." The heavy pounding on my front door echoed through my small apartment. The violent blows rattled the cheap wood and shook the framed pictures hanging on my living room wall. I stood perfectly still in my kitchen, listening to the muffled sounds of my family shouting from the hallway. My father Desmond was demanding that I open the door immediately. My mother Vivian was threatening to call the building manager to force their way inside. My personal cell phone sat on the kitchen counter displaying 57 missed calls and a relentless flood of angry text messages. I did not panic. I did not cry. My entire career as a forensic accountant was built on remaining completely calm in high-pressure situations. I spent my days dismantling corporate fraud and confronting hostile executives who firmly believed they could hide their financial crimes from the world. I knew exactly how to detach my personal emotions and focus entirely on the cold, hard facts. The undeniable fact was that my family had somehow discovered my anonymous lottery win. I took a slow, deep breath and walked toward the door. I reached out and turned the deadbolt. Before I could even pull the door open all the way, my mother forced her entire body inside. Vivian pushed past me, bringing the heavy, suffocating scent of her expensive floral perfume into my modest entryway. She was dressed in a pristine white tennis outfit, a stark contrast to my scuffed linoleum floors and simple furniture. My younger sister Monique and her husband Preston followed closely behind her, entering my home without an ounce of respect. My father Desmond brought up the rear and closed the door with a heavy thud that felt entirely too final. My mother did not even bother to say hello or ask how I was doing. She marched right up to me, and her manicured fingers clamped down hard on my forearm. Her physical grip was painful and deeply aggressive. She called me a selfish brat and hissed that I had won $120 million and maliciously tried to hide it from my own blood. She demanded to know how I could be so deceitful and ungrateful to the very people who raised me. I looked down at her hand violently grasping my arm. I did not pull away immediately. I just stared at her fingers until she felt the absolute coldness in my gaze and let go. I smoothed out the fabric of my sleeve and stepped back, creating a physical boundary between us. I was no longer the terrified teenager they used to regularly bully into quiet submission. I was a 32-year-old woman who exposed liars and financial criminals for a living. I looked at the four of them standing in my tiny living room, acting as if they owned the space and everything in it. I asked them how they found out about the money. I kept my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional reaction. I told them that I had paid elite lawyers to set up a blind trust. I explained that the State Lottery Commission had permanently sealed the public records and that it was legally impossible for the general public or anyone else to know the true identity of the Vanguard Holdings beneficiary. Preston stepped forward into the center of the room. He looked around my apartment with a visible sneer of disgust before settling his arrogant gaze directly on me. He casually adjusted the cuffs of his tailored designer suit. He smiled maliciously and told me that I really thought I was the smartest person in the room. He said that I had routed the initial Vanguard Holdings wire through a regional Chase Bank branch to set up my new offshore accounts. He reminded me that he proudly oversees regional wealth management for the entire southeastern seaboard at that specific banking institution. Preston boasted that a $120 million deposit triggers massive internal liquidity alerts across the entire district. He crossed his arms over his chest and told me that I was simply not smart enough to hide my money from him. He paced across my faded rug, acting as though he was a king surveying his newly conquered territory. He explained his surveillance process with immense and foolish pride. He said that when he saw the massive alert populate on his secure system, he instantly knew it was highly suspicious. A brand new anonymous trust, receiving the exact payout amount of the local lottery jackpot, was too much of a coincidence for him to ignore. So he used his top-tier executive banking clearance to access the highly confidential routing metadata. He illegally bypassed the legal trust name and tracked the origin files straight back to my personal social security number and private identification records. He laughed a harsh, cruel sound and said that I honestly thought a little legal paperwork would keep him from finding out about our family money. The phrase "our family money" hung in the quiet air of my apartment like a foul odor. Monique crossed her arms over her chest and glared at me with absolute contempt. She played the victim just as she had successfully done her entire life. She whined about how she could not believe I would do this terrible thing to them. She complained that they had struggled so much to maintain their high society lifestyle while I was just going to sit here in this terrible dump hoarding all that cash for myself. She said that we were supposed to be a loving family and that I owed them a massive share of the winnings for everything they had to put up with over the past 3 decades. My father Desmond stepped forward and reached into his expensive leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and slammed them down onto my cheap kitchen table. The sound made a sharp crack in the room, but I kept my facial expression entirely blank. Desmond used his deep, commanding voice, the exact tone he always used when he wanted to force me into silent submission. He stated that he was the one who physically bought the winning ticket at the restaurant, so legally, half of that money belonged to him. He declared that since I clearly lacked the fundamental financial literacy to manage this kind of extreme wealth, they had graciously made arrangements on my behalf to protect the funds. I looked down at the documents resting on the table. The bold text at the top of the page read, "Irrevocable Power of Attorney and Asset Transfer Agreement." I looked back up at my father and asked him what exactly this was supposed to be. Desmond aggressively tapped the thick paper with his index finger. He demanded that I sign $60 million over to Preston's wealth management firm right now without any further discussion. He brought up my past failures, claiming that I could not even manage to keep my college scholarship when I was 18 years old. He shouted that I would completely blow this entire fortune in a single year if they stupidly left it in my incompetent hands. The mention of my lost college scholarship was a classic psychological manipulation tactic. It was their absolute favorite piece of revisionist family history. When I was 18 years old, I earned a full academic ride to a highly prestigious university based entirely on my own merit and relentless studying. However, the scholarship required a very small parental contribution to cover the remaining costs of room and board. My parents completely refused to pay it, claiming they desperately needed the funds for Monique's elite cheerleading pageants and expensive private prep school tuition. I was forced to forfeit the prestigious scholarship and take out crippling high-interest student loans to attend a local state college instead. They had deliberately sabotaged my education and my future to favor my sister. Yet for 14 long years, they had weaponized that exact failure against me. They constantly rewrote the narrative, claiming I lost the scholarship because I was not smart enough or dedicated enough to succeed. They used their own financial abuse as definitive proof of my incompetence. My mother Vivian chimed in while nervously smoothing her perfectly styled hair. She enthusiastically insisted that this contract was for my own good. She claimed that Preston was a verified financial genius who knew exactly how to invest and handle millions of dollars in the stock market. She deeply insulted my career, saying that I just crunched boring numbers in a dusty cubicle, while Preston understood how real wealth operated. She told me that I desperately needed his corporate expertise to protect our family legacy from my own poor decisions. She also casually added that Monique and Preston critically needed to upgrade their luxury home to properly host the country club galas this upcoming season. So it was only fair that I willingly contribute my share of the winnings to support my sister. I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy contract. I flipped through the thick pages, carefully reading the dense legal jargon. My entire professional career was built on dissecting complex financial legalese and uncovering hidden corporate traps. I rapidly read the specific clauses they had drafted. The document would legally grant Preston absolute control over $60 million with zero fiduciary oversight or accountability. He could legally transfer it to untraceable offshore accounts, spend it on personal lavish luxuries, or gamble it away on terrible investments, and I would have absolutely no legal recourse to stop him or demand the money back. It was a blatant extortion letter dressed up as a loving family favor. I let out a small, quiet breath and placed the contract back on the solid table. The four of them watched me closely, fully expecting me to eventually crumble under their combined psychological pressure. They fully expected me to pick up a pen and sign my life away just to earn a tiny, fleeting fraction of their approval. They had actively conditioned me for 32 years to yield to their demands and sacrifice my own well-being for their ultimate comfort. They thought this glorious day would end with them walking out the door as multimillionaires, but they completely forgot who they were dealing with. I looked at the contract one more time and then slowly raised my eyes to look dead at Preston. I let the silence stretch out in the room until the smug, arrogant confidence on his pale face began to waver slightly under my intense stare. I deliberately lowered my voice to a calm, clinical, and highly professional register. I told Preston that he had just stood inside my home in front of 3 witnesses and explicitly admitted to illegally breaching strict banking privacy laws to access an anonymous client's confidential routing data. Preston blinked rapidly, and his arrogant smile severely faltered. He asked me what I was talking about, though his voice heavily lacked its previous booming strength. I stepped closer to him and explained that Vanguard Holdings is a legally protected blind trust designed specifically to shield beneficiaries. I told him that accessing a client's private financial metadata without a federal warrant or an explicit internal audit authorization is a direct and severe violation of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. I stated clearly and coldly that what he did was a severe federal offense punishable by extensive prison time. I watched the color slowly begin to drain from his face, but I absolutely did not stop. I told him that he had maliciously used his executive banking clearance for personal financial gain to illegally track a private citizen's assets. I pointed out that he deliberately bypassed rigid security protocols on a 9-figure deposit simply because he was greedy and insatiably curious. I asked him if the Federal Bureau of Investigation knew that he commits federal wire felonies to appease his father-in-law. I asked him if the massive compliance department at Chase Bank knew that he routinely shatters strict federal banking regulations to stalk women in his own family. The room went completely still. The silence was absolute and entirely suffocating. My father Desmond looked over at Preston, waiting for him to laugh it off, waiting for the wealthy white savior to confidently put me back in my place. But Preston did not laugh. His jaw tightened aggressively, and a thick bead of cold sweat formed at his temple. He knew I was exactly right. He was a high-level banking executive, and he fully knew that he had just confessed out loud to a career-ending prison sentence-level federal crime. My mother. Vivian broke the suffocating silence, her voice trembling slightly with newfound fear. She frantically asked Preston what I was talking about and demanded that he tell me to shut up and sign the legal papers. She aggressively tugged on his expensive suit sleeve, waiting for him to assert his dominance over me and save their grand financial plan. But Preston could not speak a single word. He just stood there, completely frozen in terror, staring at me. He recognized for the very first time that the quiet scapegoat sister sitting in the corner all those years was not a helpless punching bag. I was an apex predator in my own professional domain, and he had just willingly stepped straight into my trap. Preston backed away slowly, his arrogant smirk completely dissolving into an expression of absolute panic. He looked like a cornered animal realizing he had stepped into a trap he could not buy his way out of. My father Desmond grabbed Preston's arm and pulled him toward the hallway. Desmond turned back to me with a face full of venom. He shouted that this was not over and declared that he was going to hire the best lawyers in Atlanta to sue me for every single penny of the lottery winnings. He promised to freeze my assets by Monday morning and drag my name through the mud until I surrendered the money to the family. My mother, Vivian, hurled one last look of absolute disgust at me before following the men out of my apartment. Monique just cried fake tears, complaining that I was destroying her future. The door slammed shut, leaving me standing alone in the heavy silence of my living room. I did not waste time feeling sorry for myself. I knew my father was serious about tying up my money in a frivolous lawsuit. I knew Preston was dangerous now that he was backed into a corner. They thought they could intimidate me into submission because they forgot that I spent my entire life being invisible, which made me a phenomenal observer. I opened my secure laptop and went to work. As a forensic accountant, my specialty was dismantling financial lies. People lie, but numbers never do. I used a fraction of my new wealth to hire the most ruthless private investigative firm in the state. They had access to databases and financial records that ordinary citizens never see. I gave them a single target named Preston. I instructed them to pull every public record, every property deed, every corporate filing associated with his name and his wealth management firm. While they gathered the raw data, I began to build a digital map of his financial ecosystem. I tracked the movement of capital between his known addresses and his business entities. I requested the private investigators to physically tail Preston to see where he was spending his time during the day when he claimed to be at executive board meetings. The reports came back showing he was frequently visiting seedy off-the-grid lending offices and meeting with aggressive shadow creditors. He was pawning off expensive jewelry that Monique believed was safely stored in their bank vault. He was liquidating every single asset he could discreetly access without triggering spousal alerts. It took 3 days of relentless analyzing. I barely slept as I drank black coffee and stared at spreadsheets until my eyes burned. What I found was a financial house of cards so fragile that a single breath would blow it all down. Preston was not a wealthy man. He was a spectacular fraud. The lavish lifestyle he paraded in front of my parents was entirely funded by debt and theft. I traced his banking records and discovered a terrifying pattern of embezzlement. Preston had been systematically leveraging his clients' investment portfolios to cover his own massive losses. He had poured millions of dollars of other people's money into highly volatile cryptocurrency schemes during the previous year. When the crypto market crashed, Preston lost everything. He was drowning in margin calls and secret high-interest loans from shadow lenders. He was moving money from one client account to another just to pay the monthly interest on his personal debts. It was a classic Ponzi scheme, and it was on the verge of total collapse. As I sifted through the endless rows of digital spreadsheets, I realized that Preston was not just a terrible investor. He was a desperate man backed into a very dangerous corner. He had created a sprawling web of shell companies with names that sounded legitimate, but were essentially empty vessels used to bounce stolen funds around the globe. But the worst discovery was yet to come. I decided to run a forensic trace on my parents' financial records just to see how deeply Preston had integrated himself into their lives. My heart sank as the numbers populated on my screen. My parents had given Preston full access to their life savings, believing his promises of exclusive high-yield returns. Instead, Preston had completely drained their retirement accounts. The money my father had worked decades to save was entirely gone. I tracked a specific wire transfer of $400,000 that originated from my parents' joint savings account. Preston had routed it through 3 different dummy corporations before it finally landed in a cryptocurrency exchange account registered under a fake name. Within 24 hours, that entire sum was wiped out in a highly leveraged margin trade. He was literally gambling my parents' future on a daily basis and losing every single time. I dug deeper into recent transactions and found the billing records for the luxurious European river cruise my parents had gifted to Monique for her birthday. Preston had not paid for it, and my parents had not paid for it in cash. Preston had secretly opened a new high-limit credit card in my father's name. He charged the $28,000 vacation to Desmond and left my father to bear the crushing interest payments. Preston was a parasite feeding on my family, and my parents were too blinded by his whiteness and his perceived status to realize they were being bled dry. The sheer audacity of his crimes made my blood run cold. He was sitting at our family dinner table laughing at my cheap car while actively stealing the very roof over my parents' heads. Armed with an undeniable mountain of financial evidence, I decided to give my parents one final chance. Despite decades of emotional abuse and blatant favoritism, I still felt a lingering sense of duty to save them from total ruin. I called my father on Saturday morning and ignored his hostile greeting. I simply stated that I had information about Preston that they urgently needed to see. I told them to meet me at a quiet upscale cafe in Buckhead at noon. I chose it specifically because I knew they would feel comfortable and secure surrounded by the wealthy elite they so desperately wanted to emulate. I insisted that they come alone without Monique or Preston. My father initially refused, demanding that I just hand over the lottery money. I calmly told him that if he wanted to save his house and his future, he would be at the cafe. I arrived 30 minutes early. The air smelled of freshly ground espresso and expensive pastries. Soft jazz played from hidden speakers, creating an atmosphere of refined tranquility. It was the perfect backdrop for the absolute chaos I was about to unleash. I ordered a black tea and sat at a secluded corner table far away from the other patrons. I placed a thick manila folder on the table. Inside the folder was the complete financial autopsy of their precious son-in-law. Every stolen dollar, every forged signature, every hidden debt was documented, highlighted, and verified by licensed private investigators. I waited patiently until my parents walked through the heavy glass doors of the cafe. I watched them pull into the parking lot in their least luxury sedan. My father stepped out first, adjusting his tie and checking his reflection in the tinted windows. My mother emerged wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying a handbag that cost more than my first car. They walked arm in arm, projecting the perfect image of a successful, distinguished couple. Watching them approach the glass doors, I felt a strange tightness in my chest. For 32 years, these people had treated me like a burden. They had mocked my career, belittled my lifestyle, and constantly reminded me that I would never measure up to their golden child. Yet here I was holding the one thing that could save them from total devastation. I wondered if seeing the truth would finally break the spell. I wondered if they would finally look at me with respect or gratitude. Vivian and Desmond looked extremely out of place as they approached my corner. They sat down across from me with stiff, rigid postures. My mother refused to look at me directly, opting instead to inspect the pristine cafe decor. My father crossed his arms and demanded that I make this quick. He stated that he had already spoken to a lawyer about drafting a lawsuit to claim his rightful half of the $120 million. I did not react to his threat. I simply placed my hand on the thick manila folder and slowly pushed it across the smooth surface of the table. I looked my father directly in the eyes and told him to open it. Desmond stared at the folder suspiciously before finally flipping open the heavy cover. My mother leaned over to look at the pages, her face tight with annoyance. I did not sugarcoat the truth. I told them exactly what they were looking at. I kept my voice low and steady, ensuring my tone was entirely professional. I told my father that his perfect son-in-law was completely broke. I pointed to the specific bank statements highlighted in bright yellow ink. I explained that Preston had lost millions of dollars in unregulated cryptocurrency markets. I showed them the transfer logs proving that Preston had illegally drained their entire retirement savings just to keep himself out of federal prison. Desmond stared at the numbers as his eyes darted rapidly across the page. The financial terminology was complex, but the bottom line was unmistakably clear. The account balances read zero. I watched my father's shoulders tense as the reality of the numbers began to register in his mind. I then pulled out the final piece of evidence. I slid the credit card statement across the table. I tapped my finger on the $28,000 charge for the VIP European River cruise. I told my father that Preston did not buy that vacation for Monique. I explained that Preston had fraudulently opened a credit card using Desmond's social security number and charged the entire trip to my parents. I told them that they were currently sitting on a mountain of debt created by the man they worshipped. I waited for the realization to wash over them. I waited for the shock, for the anger at Preston, for the sudden understanding that I was trying to save them from a catastrophic financial collapse. I expected them to demand more proof, or perhaps break down in tears. I was prepared to offer them a small fraction of my lottery winnings to help them recover their stolen retirement funds. I was ready to be the daughter they never appreciated, but finally needed. Instead, my mother Vivian suddenly slammed the folder shut. The sound echoed loudly in the quiet cafe, causing several patrons to turn and stare. Her face was contorted with a level of pure rage I had never seen before. She stood up so quickly that her chair scraped violently against the floor. Before I could even process her movement, she reached across the small table and slapped me hard across the face. The physical impact was shocking. My cheek burned instantly, radiating pain down into my jaw. Several people at the surrounding tables gasped audibly. A waiter carrying a tray of coffees stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes wide with shock. The entire cafe went completely silent. My father did not flinch. He did not try to stop her. He just sat there glaring at me with equal hatred. My mother stood towering over me, her chest heaving with exertion. Her eyes were completely wild, filled with a toxic mixture of denial and hatred. She leaned over the table, her voice trembling with furious indignation. She yelled that I was a jealous, vindictive liar. She screamed that I had maliciously forged these documents to frame Preston. She claimed I was doing all of this just to make them look foolish, so I could keep the entire lottery fortune for myself. She said that Preston was a good man from a good family and that I was nothing but a bitter failure who could not stand to see my sister happy. She pointed a shaking finger at my face. She declared loudly that I was dead to them. She told me to take my fake evidence and my stolen money and rot in hell. Vivian turned on her heel and stormed out of the cafe. Desmond stood up, smoothed his jacket, and followed her without a single word. He did not care that his wife had just assaulted his own daughter in a crowded public space. He only cared that I had dared to challenge the fantasy they had built their entire identity around. I sat alone at the table. I slowly raised my hand and touched my burning red cheek. The physical pain was sharp, but the emotional clarity was absolute. They were presented with undeniable proof of their own destruction, and they chose to protect the white man who was robbing them blind simply because he provided them with the illusion of status. They chose their own toxic vanity over the truth. They chose the man ruining them over the daughter trying to save them. I looked at the abandoned folder on the table. I realized in that defining moment that my family was entirely complicit in their own downfall. I slowly lowered my hand from my face. The lingering desire to save them completely evaporated from my soul. The slap was not a punishment, it was a release. It was the final physical severing of the invisible chains that had bound me to their approval. I packed the documents back into my briefcase and walked out into the warm Atlanta sun. I decided right then and there that I would no longer try to pull them out of the fire. I would simply stand back and let them burn. The warm Atlanta sun felt like a strange comfort as I walked to my car, leaving my parents sitting in the cafe with the blueprint of their own financial ruin. I drove back to my secure apartment and calmly waited for their next move. Because I knew people like Preston and Monique never retreat when they are caught. They escalate to protect their fragile reality. 2 days later, the escalation arrived in the form of a heavily perspiring man in a cheap suit banging on my lobby door. He was holding a thick stack of legal papers. I had been officially served. I sat at my small kitchen table and read through the lawsuit page by page. The sheer audacity of it almost made me smile. Preston and Monique had deliberately bypassed respectable corporate firms and hired a notorious local attorney known exclusively for aggressive public smear campaigns rather than actual legal strategy. The lawsuit itself was a masterpiece of fiction. It formally claimed that my father Desmond had purposefully purchased the winning Mega Millions ticket and absent-mindedly placed it in his coat pocket during our disastrous birthday dinner at the steakhouse. The document alleged that I had maliciously stolen the ticket from his coat while he was distracted by the celebration and fraudulently claimed the $120 million as my own. It was a complete fabrication, a desperate lie woven together by two greedy people who needed cash immediately to avoid federal prison. But they did not just file the lawsuit in the local county court. They purposefully sent copies to every major news outlet and gossip blog in Atlanta. By the next morning, my quiet, anonymous life was entirely shattered. I woke up to the heavy thumping sound of news helicopters circling above my apartment building. Local reporters were camped out on the sidewalk, shoving heavy microphones and bright camera lenses at anyone who walked in or out of my lobby. My personal phone was completely useless, flooded with interview requests and violent hate mail from strangers who had read the sensationalized morning headlines. Daughter steals $100 million jackpot from elderly parents was the dominant narrative playing across every local channel. It was the perfect tabloid story, and my toxic family was playing the local press like a finely tuned instrument. The ultimate blow came around noon when I received a highly secure, urgent email from the senior partners at my forensic accounting firm. They requested an immediate remote meeting. When I logged onto the video call, their faces were incredibly grim. They told me that while they highly valued my exceptional work and flawless track record, the current media circus surrounding my name was a massive liability for a firm that handled extremely sensitive corporate audits. Clients require absolute discretion, they explained while nervously avoiding eye contact with my image on the screen. They said that until this ugly legal matter was fully resolved, they had no choice but to place me on indefinite administrative leave. I nodded, calmly, thanked them for their time, and closed the laptop. My family was actively trying to destroy my professional reputation, the one thing I had built entirely on my own through years of grinding hard work. They desperately wanted to paint me as the ultimate villain, so Monique eagerly took her performance to local daytime television. I sat on my sofa and watched her appear on a popular Atlanta morning show. She wore a modest pastel dress specifically chosen to make her look incredibly innocent and heartbroken. She sat on the velvet studio couch and squeezed out perfect crocodile tears for the high-definition cameras. She told the deeply sympathetic television host that our family was absolutely devastated by my horrific betrayal. She claimed that my father was suffering from severe physical and emotional distress because his own flesh and blood had robbed him of his peaceful retirement dreams. She looked directly into the camera lens, her voice trembling with practiced fake emotion, and begged me to do the right thing and return the stolen ticket money to our loving parents. She told the entire city of Atlanta that she had always tried to be a supportive sister to me, but that I was nothing but a jealous thief who let pure greed destroy our sacred family bond. It was a masterclass in dark psychological manipulation, and the viewing public swallowed it whole. The internet comments scrolling at the bottom of the screen were brutal, calling for my immediate arrest and demanding harsh justice for my poor, victimized parents. I did not let the public outrage break my focus or trigger an emotional response. Instead, I requested a highly secure private meeting with the senior managing partner of the elite wealth protection firm handling my Vanguard Holdings trust. I sat in his sprawling modern office overlooking the vast Atlanta skyline while he carefully reviewed the lawsuit my family had filed against me. He tossed the thick document onto his polished mahogany desk with a quiet, dismissive scoff. He looked at me and stated that this lawsuit was completely frivolous and essentially legal garbage. He explained that we could easily crush their entire case in a single afternoon hearing. He reminded me that his firm had already secured the surveillance footage from the gas station, proving my father never stepped foot inside to buy a ticket that day. He noted that we had the sworn affidavits and the restaurant receipts, showing my father threw the ticket at me in front of multiple waitstaff. He confidently told me that we had a mountain of irrefutable digital evidence that would have their cheap lawyer laughed out of court and severely sanctioned by the state bar. He leaned forward and promised that we could win this easily and completely restore my public reputation by the end of the week. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city far below. I thought about my mother violently slapping me in the quiet cafe when I tried to save them from ruin. I thought about Monique crying fake tears on television to destroy my career. I thought about Preston secretly mortgaging my parents' house to cover his illegal cryptocurrency debts while boldly pretending to be the victim of my supposed greed. I turned back to my highly paid lawyer and told him no. I told him that I did not just want to win a simple lawsuit. Winning was entirely too easy, and it would only send them scurrying back into the shadows to plan their next manipulative attack against me. I told him that I wanted them to completely expose themselves to the world. I wanted them to dig a financial and legal hole so incredibly deep that they could never possibly climb out of it. I specifically instructed my lawyer to heavily delay the court proceedings and deliberately hold back all of our exonerating evidence. I explained that I needed Preston to truly believe he was actually winning the public relations war. I needed him to feel just enough false confidence to make a massive fatal mistake. I knew exactly how to manipulate a cornered financial criminal because I spent my life studying their behavior. I knew Preston was rapidly running out of time. My previous forensic dive into his personal accounts proved that his shadow lenders were aggressively closing in on him. The bank auditors would soon discover the millions of dollars he had illegally embezzled from his wealthy clients. This entire media circus was a desperate smokescreen designed to force me into a quick, quiet cash settlement before his entire fraudulent corporate empire collapsed around him. So I decided to give him exactly what he wanted, but wrapped in a beautiful, deadly trap. I returned to my quiet apartment and opened my encrypted laptop. I drafted a highly specific email addressed directly to Preston and his sleazy attorney. I titled the message Confidential Settlement Offer. I meticulously kept the language desperate and yielding, playing the exact role of the terrified, broken sister they always expected me to be. I wrote that the intense media pressure was ruining my fragile mental health and completely destroying my accounting career. I typed that I just wanted this entire family nightmare to be over so I could move on with my life in peace. I formally offered to surrender $10 million to Preston immediately if he agreed to drop the lawsuit and publicly clear my name in the press. But I included one very specific legally binding condition in the text of the email. I stated that because my assets were currently frozen in a highly complex offshore holding trust, I could not write a standard domestic check or wire the funds to a regular local bank. I told him that the $10 million had to be wired directly to an offshore account of his choosing. I explicitly stated that the receiving account must be completely untraceable and exist entirely beyond the reach of United States tax authorities to protect my own trust anonymity. It was the ultimate bait for a desperate white-collar criminal drowning in stolen funds. A standard domestic transfer would instantly trigger severe banking audits and massive IRS flags, which Preston absolutely could not afford with his ongoing embezzlement schemes about to be exposed. An offshore wire transfer was the only possible way he could secretly absorb that massive amount of cash to pay off his violent shadow lenders without alerting his corporate bank managers. I read over the email one last time, checking every word for the perfect tone of defeat. I hit send and watched the message vanish into the digital ether. I sat back in the quiet isolation of my apartment, listening to the distant hum of city traffic outside my window. I knew exactly what was happening in Preston's greedy mind at that very moment. I was handing him the exact shovel he needed to dig his own grave. If he accepted the settlement offer and provided me with his secret offshore routing numbers, he would be committing heavily documented federal extortion and international money laundering. He would be directly handing me the definitive, unassailable proof of his hidden financial network that I needed to destroy him. The trap was perfectly set and the bait was incredibly sweet. All that remained was to sit back and see if Preston's insatiable greed and desperate need for self-preservation would override his professional caution. I did not have to wait long. The digital trap I set was simply too tempting for a man drowning in his own financial crimes. Less than 12 hours after I sent my fabricated settlement offer, a new message appeared in my encrypted inbox. It was early Wednesday morning, and the pale light of dawn was just beginning to filter through my living room windows. I sat at my kitchen table with a hot cup of black coffee watching the notification icon blink on my laptop screen. Preston had replied. His response was a masterpiece of arrogant corporate posturing layered over absolute blinding panic. He wrote back with the formal tone of a wealth manager pretending to negotiate a minor contract dispute, but his eagerness betrayed him completely. He formally accepted my $10 million offer to drop the frivolous lawsuit and silence the media smear campaign. He explicitly stated that this generous compromise was the only way to save our family from further public embarrassment. He really believed he had won. He believed that his aggressive tactics and his sleazy lawyer had successfully terrified me into surrendering a massive chunk of my lottery winnings. But the most crucial part of his email was buried at the very bottom. Exactly as I had demanded, Preston provided the detailed wiring instructions for the offshore account. He did not use a standard domestic bank. He did not use his own wealth management firm. Instead, he provided the SWIFT code and routing numbers for a highly obscure financial institution located in the Cayman Islands. The receiving account was registered to a shell company named Apex Global Holdings. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly what Apex Global Holdings was. It was a ghost entity, a digital phantom created solely to receive and wash illicit funds far beyond the jurisdiction of the United States Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Preston needed that $10 million immediately to cover the massive hole he had blown in his clients' portfolios. He was frantically trying to plug the leaks in his sinking ship before the federal bank auditors arrived to examine his books. If he routed my $10 million through a standard American bank, the sudden massive influx of cash would trigger intense scrutiny. The authorities would freeze the funds and instantly uncover his sprawling embezzlement scheme. He had to use the Cayman Islands account to bypass the system. By sending me those specific routing numbers along with a written agreement to drop a fraudulent lawsuit in exchange for cash, Preston had just documented his own federal extortion. He had handed me the murder weapon with his fingerprints pressed deeply into the metal. I was in the middle of taking a screenshot of his Cayman Islands routing data when my personal cell phone began to vibrate on the counter. The caller ID displayed Monique's name. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow, deep breath to perfectly steady my heart rate before sliding my thumb across the screen to answer. I did not say hello. I just waited in silence. "Well, it looks like you finally learned your place," Monique said. Her voice was dripping with absolute toxic satisfaction. She sounded like she was lounging by a pool, and I could hear the faint clinking of glassware in the background. "Preston just told me you agreed to the settlement," she continued, her tone incredibly smug and condescending. "I knew you would eventually cave, Cleo. You always were too weak to handle real pressure. You should be thanking us honestly. We are doing you a massive favor by taking this burden off your hands before you ruin yourself." I kept my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. I told her that the money would be transferred as soon as the legal paperwork was finalized. "You had better send the money by Friday." Monique snapped, her fake sweet tone instantly dissolving into a harsh, vicious threat. "Preston already has his lawyers drawing up the withdrawal papers for the lawsuit. But if we do not see that wire transfer clear by Friday afternoon, we are going straight to the police. We will tell them, you manipulated Dad and stole the ticket. We will make sure you end up in prison, Cleo. Do not test us." I listened to my younger sister threaten me with prison time, simply because she wanted to steal my money to fund her fake luxury lifestyle. I asked her how she could possibly do this to her own sister. I asked her why she hated me so much when I had never done anything but try to quietly survive in the background of her perfect life. Monique let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "Oh, please, Cleo, do not play the victim with me," she scoffed. "You have always been a mess, and I have always had to be the one to clean up the family image after your constant failures. You were always such an embarrassment to Mom and Dad, just like when you failed to get into a real college and had to settle for that pathetic state school. You really thought you were so smart studying all night in your room, but you were never in my league." I frowned, staring at the wall of my kitchen. I told her that I did not fail to get into a good college. I reminded her that I lost my academic scholarship because our parents refused to pay the remaining balance. Monique laughed again, a sound so deeply ugly and vindictive that it made my skin crawl. "You really are clueless, are not you?" she sneered. "You did not just lose that one state scholarship, Cleo. You got rejected from everywhere else, too. Columbia, Yale, Penn. You thought you were going to the Ivy League, but you were not good enough." I stopped breathing. The air in my apartment suddenly felt freezing cold. I had applied to 4 Ivy League universities when I was a senior in high school. I had perfect grades, immaculate test scores, and glowing recommendation letters. But I never received a single response, no acceptance letters, and no rejection letters. Just total silence. I had assumed my applications were lost or that I was simply entirely forgettable. The silence from those schools had destroyed my self-esteem and convinced me that I was truly the failure my parents always claimed I was. "How do you know about Columbia and Yale?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Because Mom showed them to me." Monique bragged, her arrogance blinding her to the terrible secret she was spilling. She showed me the thick envelopes when they arrived in the mail. Mom said it would be a disaster for the family image if the awkward, ugly duckling sister went to an Ivy League school while I was busy focusing on my pageant career. Mom said it would upset the natural balance of things. So she threw your acceptance letters in the kitchen trash before you even got home from school. She burned them in the fireplace that same night. You never even had a chance, Cleo. Mom made sure I would always be the only successful child in this family. The phone felt incredibly heavy in my hand. The silence stretching between us was absolute. A fundamental shift occurred deep within the core of my being. For 32 years, I had carried the heavy, crushing weight of believing I was inadequate. I had built my entire life around the painful assumption that I was not smart enough or special enough to achieve greatness. I had accepted my role as the family disappointment because I believed the evidence supported it. But it was all a lie. It was a massive, cruel, calculated lie engineered by my own mother to protect my sister's fragile ego. Vivian had actively sabotaged my future. She had held my dreams in her hands and literally thrown them into the fire just to keep me beneath them. "You are awfully quiet," Cleo Monique taunted, entirely oblivious to the monumental damage she had just caused. "Just make sure that 10 million is wired to Preston's offshore account by Friday. Maybe then Mom and Dad will finally forgive you for being such a horrible daughter." I did not say goodbye. I simply ended the call and placed the phone face down on the kitchen counter. I stood perfectly still in my apartment for a very long time. My chest physically ached as 14 years of misplaced shame and self-doubt evaporated into thin air, leaving behind a cold, sharp, and entirely pure rage. They had not just stolen my college experience. They had stolen my confidence. They had stolen my belief in my own potential. They had manipulated my entire reality to keep me exactly where they wanted me, trapped beneath their designer shoes. I walked slowly back to my laptop. The screen was still glowing with Preston's settlement offer and the Cayman Islands routing numbers. I looked at the offshore account details. $10 million to make the lawsuit go away. $10 million to buy their silence. $10 million to fund the life of the sister who laughed while my mother burned my future. I was not going to wire them a single dime. I opened a secure file directory on my desktop. I gathered the exhaustive dossier my private investigators had compiled on Preston's massive embezzlement scheme. I attached the irrefutable proof that he had completely drained my parents' retirement accounts and leveraged his clients' portfolios into highly volatile cryptocurrency losses. I attached the forged power of attorney documents my father had tried to force me to sign. I attached the threatening text messages from my family. And finally, I attached the email Preston had just sent me, the digital smoking gun, where a licensed banking executive explicitly demanded a $10 million extortion payment be routed to a hidden shell company in the Cayman Islands. I meticulously organized the files into a single heavily encrypted digital package. I labeled every document with the precision and clarity of a master forensic accountant, presenting a flawless case to a federal grand jury. The evidence was completely overwhelming. There was no possible defense, no legal loophole, and no amount of high-priced lawyers that could save Preston from the sheer volume of financial crimes I had just documented. I opened a new secure communication portal. I did not send the package to the local Atlanta Police Department. I did not send it to the State Banking Commission. Local authorities could be stalled or bribed. I needed a strike so precise and so devastating that Preston would never see the sun outside of a prison yard ever again. I navigated directly to the official digital tip line for the White-Collar Crime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I specifically flagged the package for the attention of the Bank Fraud and International Money Laundering Task Force. I sat there staring at the final submission button. I thought about my mother smiling warmly at Preston while he insulted my neighborhood. I thought about my father throwing the lottery ticket at my face like I was trash. I thought about Monique's cruel laughter as she admitted they had destroyed my Ivy League acceptances just to keep me feeling small. My family was a disease, and Preston was the parasite that was going to finally kill them. They had built a fortress of lies and deception, and they expected me to quietly pay to keep their walls from crumbling. I reached out and touched my cheek exactly where my mother had violently slapped me in the cafe. The skin was no longer red, but the memory of her toxic hatred was burned permanently into my mind. She had slapped me for telling the truth. She had slapped me for trying to save them from a criminal. They had made their choice. They had chosen the illusion of wealth over their own daughter. They were entirely complicit in their own destruction. I looked at the screen one last time. I moved the cursor over the submit button, and without a single ounce of hesitation or regret, I pressed down. The progress bar flashed across the screen, and the encrypted package of evidence vanished into the secure servers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The deed was done. There was no turning back. Preston was about to be investigated by the most ruthless financial regulators in the country, and his entire house of cards was going to collapse directly onto my parents' heads. I closed my laptop, took a sip of my cold coffee, and smiled. I decided to sit back and watch them burn. I watched Friday come and go from the absolute tranquility of my small apartment. I knew exactly what was happening in Preston's sleek corporate office downtown. I could picture him sitting in his ergonomic leather chair, obsessively refreshing his encrypted browser, staring at the permanent zero balance in his offshore Cayman Islands account. The $10 million I had promised him was never going to arrive. My highly paid private investigators reported that by early Friday afternoon, Preston's behavior had become deeply and visibly erratic. He was frantically pacing the marble floors of his wealth management firm, snapping viciously at his administrative assistants, and abruptly canceling crucial client meetings. The internal bank auditors from Chase were officially moving in. My anonymous, heavily documented FBI tip had clearly triggered an immediate and aggressive internal compliance review. Preston was rapidly running out of time and oxygen. His massive embezzlement scheme was unraveling faster than he could control, and he desperately needed immediate liquidity to temporarily balance the stolen funds before the federal auditors dug too deeply into his compromised portfolios. When a white-collar criminal panics, they always return to their easiest and most gullible marks. Preston could not go to a traditional bank for a commercial loan because his credit was already secretly destroyed, and any legitimate financial institution would immediately flag his highly suspicious leverage ratios. He needed naive, trusting victims who possessed substantial tangible assets and absolutely zero actual financial literacy. So he went straight to my parents. My investigators tracked his movements early Saturday morning. He drove his leased luxury car to my parents' affluent suburban neighborhood, pulling up to the pristine colonial estate where I had spent my entire childhood, feeling entirely invisible and unwanted. My father, Desmond, and my mother, Vivian, welcomed him with open arms, completely unaware that they were inviting a desperate cornered predator into their sanctuary. Through a combination of my investigators' discreet audio surveillance and the aggressive legal discovery we later initiated, I learned exactly how Preston executed his final and most devastating grift on the people who worshipped him. He sat in their formal living room sipping my father's most expensive imported scotch and spun a masterful web of absolute deceit. He played the role of the stressed but brilliant financial savior with perfect precision. He told Desmond and Vivian that the frivolous lottery lawsuit against me was temporarily tying up his own firm's liquid capital, preventing him from executing a massive trade. He lied effortlessly, claiming that he had an unprecedented, strictly confidential investment opportunity that required an immediate cash injection to secure a guaranteed astronomical return. He used all the right corporate buzzwords that my status-obsessed parents loved to hear. Elite access offshore dividends, exclusive bridge loan liquidity event. He told them that because of his temporary liquidity crunch, he urgently needed them to put up the family estate as collateral for a short-term commercial loan. He looked them dead in the eye and promised them that the money would be safely returned within 30 days, along with a staggering profit margin that would secure their legacy forever. My parents, who had ruthlessly scrutinized my every move my entire life and violently rejected my attempts to save them just a few days prior, did not ask Preston a single critical question. They did not ask to see the investment prospectus. They did not request a third-party financial audit or consult an independent lawyer. My father, Desmond, who had always prided himself on being a savvy patriarch, simply nodded along with a greedy, ignorant glint in his eye. Desmond looked at Vivian and confidently declared that Preston was a true financial genius. He patted Preston aggressively on the shoulder and proudly told my mother that Preston's brilliant maneuvering would easily triple their investment in a matter of weeks. Desmond smiled his arrogant, condescending smile and said they would finally have enough liquid cash to buy that sprawling, historic summer house in Martha's Vineyard they had always envied but could never quite afford. They were so blinded by their toxic pursuit of high society status and their unwavering worship of my sister's husband that they willingly placed their heads directly onto the chopping block. Desmond eagerly took the gold-plated pen Preston offered and blindly signed the legal documents transferring the deed of their fully paid-off family estate to be used as collateral for a high-risk commercial loan. With the deed to my parents' house safely tucked into his designer leather briefcase, Preston immediately sought out a source for the quick cash. He could not go to a reputable banking institution, so he turned to the dark underbelly of corporate finance. He sought out a notorious shadow lender, a ruthless private equity firm operating on the fringes of the law that specialized in high-interest predatory loans for desperate executives who needed millions of dollars overnight with no questions asked. Preston thought he was being incredibly stealthy and brilliant. He thought he had successfully bypassed the standard rigid banking regulations to secure a $2 million lifeline to temporarily appease the federal auditors breathing down his neck. He gladly handed over the deed to my parents' home, signing an aggressive short-term loan agreement with astronomical interest rates and a completely ruthless immediate default clause. But Preston was entirely oblivious to the identity of the ghost entity currently backing that specific shadow lending firm. He was so blinded by his own sheer panic and towering arrogance that he failed to run a basic forensic background check on the private equity group, handing him the $2 million. If he had utilized even a fraction of the investigative skills I used every single day as a forensic accountant, he would have easily unraveled the corporate shell companies holding that firm together. He would have traced the hidden capital back through 3 complex layers of anonymous offshore holding companies. And he would have discovered the deeply poetic truth that the predatory shadow lender he just sold my parents' home to was a wholly owned subsidiary of Vanguard Holdings, the anonymous financial trust controlled entirely by me. I had anticipated his desperation the moment I sent the FBI tip. I knew he would need fast, unregulated cash, and I specifically directed my legal team to aggressively acquire the debt portfolios of the city's most notorious shadow lenders just to cast a wide net. Preston had walked blindly into the exact financial snare I had spent my entire professional life learning how to build. I sat at my kitchen counter holding a mug of coffee and watched the digital confirmation roll into my encrypted inbox. The $2 million wire transfer had been successfully dispatched to Preston's frantic banking accounts, and the digitally signed collateral documents were securely locked in my private legal vault. I slowly reached out and traced my fingers over the freshly printed copy of the deed resting on my desk. I was looking at the exact legal title to the massive colonial house on Maple Street. The house where my mother had viciously burned my Ivy League acceptance letters in the fireplace just to protect Monique's fragile ego. The house where my father had constantly reminded me that I was a profound failure who would never amount to anything. The house where Monique was crowned the beautiful golden child, while I was treated like an unwanted servant hiding in the background. My family had traded their ultimate symbol of wealth and generational security to a desperate criminal, and now, by an absolutely beautiful stroke of karmic justice, I was the one holding the paper. I was now their sole legal creditor. I owned their debt, and I held the absolute legal right to foreclose on their precious estate the very second Preston inevitably defaulted on his impossible loan terms. The sheer magnitude of the power shift was staggering and deeply intoxicating. With a single phone call to my elite legal team, I could have legally evicted them before dinner. I could have sent heavily armed county sheriffs to physically remove my mother and her matching designer luggage from the premises. I could have thrown my father out onto the street and watched them experience the exact same terrifying abandonment and humiliation they had subjected me to my entire life. My private investigators called me that evening and asked if I wanted to initiate the foreclosure process immediately. They noted that Preston had clearly already begun defaulting on the initial interest structures because he was funneling the loan money directly into his empty client accounts to hide his tracks from the FBI. But I looked at the digital calendar open on my laptop and smiled a very cold, deeply satisfied smile. My parents were rapidly approaching the most important date on their toxic social calendar. Their massive annual summer gala was just a few weeks away. It was a lavish, highly publicized, catered event where they invited the absolute upper crust of Atlanta's elite to drink expensive imported champagne and marvel at our family's supposed immense wealth. They spent months meticulously planning every single detail, the floral arrangements, the ice sculptures, the string quartet, just to flaunt their flawless, untouchable image to the world. I realized that I did not want to evict them quietly on a random Tuesday afternoon while no one was looking. I did not want them to be able to hide their shame behind closed doors or spin another false narrative about their circumstances. I wanted their fraudulent empire to collapse in front of the very audience they had sacrificed my future to impress. I wanted every socialite, every wealthy investor, and every country club gossip to witness the exact moment the facade shattered. So I told my lawyers to hold the foreclosure paperwork. I instructed them to let the interest accumulate and let the default clauses trigger silently in the background. I decided to wait patiently in the shadows, clutching the deed to their entire world in my hands, and let them confidently prepare for the biggest and final party of their miserable lives. For the next 3 weeks, I watched my family live inside a magnificent and terrifying hallucination. Preston honestly believed he had outsmarted the entire federal banking system and successfully intimidated me into complete submission. The moment the $2 million from my shadow lending firm hit his heavily monitored accounts, he scrambled like a desperate rat to cover his tracks. My private investigators documented his every move as he quietly funneled the cash back into the portfolios of his wealthiest clients. He was frantically trying to plug the massive holes his failed cryptocurrency gambles had created before the bank auditors dug too deeply into his ledgers. He strutted around the affluent neighborhoods of Atlanta like a conquering hero. He assured my parents that his offshore bridge loan was a masterful stroke of elite corporate strategy. He explicitly convinced them that their paid-off estate was perfectly safe and that astronomical financial returns were just weeks away. My parents swallowed every single lie because it tasted exactly like the wealth and absolute social dominance they constantly craved. They were so high on their own perceived brilliance that they immediately shifted their entire focus to their upcoming 35th wedding anniversary. Vivian and Desmond decided that a standard anniversary dinner was beneath them. They needed a spectacular public coronation. They needed to show the entire city of Atlanta that the Wilson family was utterly untouchable and sitting at the very pinnacle of high society. So they booked the Grand Ballroom at the most historic and exclusive country club in the state. The venue was notoriously difficult to secure, requiring multiple board approvals, a rigid background check, and a staggering cash deposit. Preston happily funded the entire deposit using the remaining scraps of the predatory loan he had secured against my parents' home. They were literally financing their lavish party with the deed to their own house, completely blind to the fact that I was the one holding the mortgage. The preparations for the gala were intensely extravagant. My mother hired a team of elite event planners who charged exorbitant hourly rates. She ordered thousands of imported white orchids to cascade from the massive crystal chandeliers. She commissioned a towering 5-tier cake decorated with edible gold leaf and booked a classical string quartet that usually only played for visiting foreign dignitaries. Monique naturally saw the anniversary gala as a personal showcase for her own fabricated success. My private investigators documented her reckless spending habits as she prepared for the event. She spent an entire Tuesday afternoon at an exclusive bridal and evening wear boutique in the luxury shopping district of Buckhead. She treated the retail staff like absolute garbage, demanding vintage champagne and rejecting dozens of beautiful dresses before finally settling on a custom beaded gown that cost $15,000. She did not even blink at the astronomical price tag. She just casually handed over a platinum credit card that was entirely linked to Preston's deeply compromised corporate accounts. I listened to the audio recordings gathered by my team as Monique sat in a luxury salon getting a $500 facial later that week. She loudly bragged to her shallow friends about Preston's unmatched financial genius. She confidently boasted that her pathetic estranged sister was about to be destroyed in court and that they were expecting a massive multi-million-dollar settlement from my frozen lottery assets any day now. She told her friends that she always had to clean up my messes ever since we were kids. She laughed as she casually mentioned how she was the only successful child because I was too stupid to get into an Ivy League school. She happily recounted the story of how my mother Vivian had secretly intercepted my acceptance letters from Yale and Columbia and burned them in the fireplace just to ensure Monique remained the sole pride of the family. She truly believed I was sitting alone in my apartment, paralyzed by fear, while she prepared to inherit my fortune. But I was not paralyzed. I was incredibly busy finalizing the mechanics of their total destruction. While my mother debated between silk napkins and velvet table runners, I was sitting in a sterile windowless conference room inside a highly secure federal building. I was working directly with 3 senior agents from the bank fraud division of the FBI. They had received my anonymous encrypted dossier and immediately verified the Cayman Islands routing numbers Preston had sent to me in his extortion email. The agents were absolutely thrilled with the clean, irrefutable trail of digital evidence I had handed them. We spent hours meticulously walking through Preston's digital footprint. I used my skills as a forensic accountant to show them exactly how he had manipulated the banking software to hide the missing client funds. I mapped out the complex web of dummy corporations he used to wash the money across international borders. The lead investigator, a sharp woman with tired eyes, shook her head in sheer disbelief at Preston's monumental arrogance. She told me that white-collar criminals usually build intricate firewalls to protect themselves, but Preston had essentially painted a giant neon target on his own back by trying to extort a lottery winner through international wires. The FBI quietly secured federal warrants for all of Preston's corporate and personal accounts. They froze his assets and began preparing the indictments. The net was fully woven and ready to drop. As the date of the anniversary gala rapidly approached, I turned my full attention to the historic country club my parents had booked for their celebration. I knew the social hierarchy of Atlanta very well, and I knew that even the most prestigious institutions often hid dark financial secrets behind their ivy-covered brick walls. I assigned my forensic accounting team to dig deep into the country club's operational holdings. It did not take long to find the rot hidden beneath the surface. The club was completely drowning in operational debt. The board of directors had mismanaged their pension funds for years, and the property was heavily leveraged with a private commercial banking group. They were desperate for a massive cash injection to avoid a public restructuring that would absolutely destroy their elite reputation among the old money families of Georgia. I saw an absolutely beautiful and poetic opportunity. Using Vanguard Holdings, I instructed my legal team to approach the club's primary creditors. We moved quickly and silently, utilizing airtight non-disclosure agreements. Within 48 hours, Vanguard Holdings purchased the entirety of the country club's management debt at a premium. I did not just secure a table at the restaurant or bribe a manager to let me inside. I literally bought the financial leverage to control the entire property. I was now the silent majority stakeholder of the venue where my parents were hosting their ultimate triumph. Once the ink on the acquisition papers was dry, I quietly instructed the club management to give Vivian and Desmond absolutely everything they requested for their party. I told the general manager to entirely ignore the budget limits they had set. I authorized them to approve every single lavish upgrade my mother demanded, and to let the final catering tab run as high as my parents' arrogant hearts desired. I wanted the rope they were hanging themselves with to be made of pure gold and financed entirely by their own catastrophic hubris. The day of the anniversary gala finally arrived. It was a gorgeous Saturday evening, with clear skies and a gentle, warm southern breeze. My private investigators sent me real-time updates as my family prepared for the night of their lives. Desmond was fitted into a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo, feeling like a titan of industry and the master of his domain. Vivian spent 4 hours having her hair and makeup professionally done, draping herself in heavy diamond jewelry that Preston had likely purchased with stolen client funds. Monique slipped into her $15,000 custom-beaded gown, practically vibrating with toxic vanity and unearned pride. Preston poured himself a glass of 50-year-old scotch, looking out over his manicured lawn, fully believing he had successfully navigated the storm and secured his place among the wealthy elite. They rode together to the venue in a rented stretch limousine, drinking expensive imported champagne and laughing at my expense. They pulled up to the grand entrance of the historic country club, entirely oblivious to the fact that they were walking straight into a meticulously designed slaughterhouse. Back in my quiet apartment, I began my own preparations. I did not put on a cheap dress or try to blend into the background. The girl who wore clearance rack clothing and drove a rusty 10-year-old Honda Civic no longer existed. I opened a heavy garment bag that had been delivered earlier that week from a private tailor. Inside was a custom-designed designer power suit. It was cut from the finest dark charcoal wool with a razor-sharp silhouette that projected absolute authority and icy control. I slipped into the suit and adjusted the lapels, feeling the heavy, expensive fabric settle against my shoulders. I paired it with simple, elegant stilettos and pulled my hair back into a sleek, severe style that left my face completely exposed. I looked in the tall mirror and saw a predator fully prepared for the hunt. I did not look angry or sad or desperate. I looked like a woman who held the absolute power of life and death over the people who had tried to break her. I grabbed my slim leather briefcase containing the physical copies of the property deeds, the forged loan documents, and the active federal warrants. I walked out of my apartment and took the elevator down to the private garage. I was not taking a rideshare tonight. Waiting for me in the reserved parking bay was a sleek, jet-black armored Maybach that I had purchased through my trust. The heavy doors closed with a solid, reassuring thud, sealing me inside a soundproof vault of absolute luxury. My private driver pulled smoothly out of the garage and merged into the evening traffic. I sat in the spacious back seat, watching the bright city lights blur past the heavily tinted windows. My pulse was remarkably steady, and my breathing was calm. I was not nervous about crashing their perfect party. I was not planning on sneaking through the service entrance or causing a loud, emotional scene in the middle of the crowded ballroom. I had absolutely no reason to act like a crazy, uninvited guest because I was not a guest at all. The Maybach glided up the long, manicured driveway of the historic country club, passing the long line of luxury sedans waiting at the valet stand. The tires crunched softly on the gravel as we pulled directly up to the grand entrance, bypassing the queue entirely. I gathered my briefcase and waited for my driver to open the heavy armored door. I stepped out into the warm evening air, smoothing the front of my tailored suit as the valet staff rushed forward to attend to the vehicle. I could hear the faint sound of the string quartet playing from the ballroom and the low murmur of wealthy patrons mingling on the terrace. I was about to walk into a room filled with the most powerful people in the city and permanently erase my family from polite society. I owned their massive debts. I owned the very house they slept in. And as I looked up at the towering white columns of the country club, I smiled a very cold smile, knowing that I legally owned the very ground they were dancing on. The doors of the Maybach closed with a heavy, solid thud, sealing me inside my quiet sanctuary as my driver pulled smoothly away from the country club. I did not look back at the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the towering white columns. I left my family to navigate the absolute wreckage of their grand illusion entirely on their own. 3 days later, the suffocating reality of their new existence finally settled over them like a thick, heavy shroud. The federal government does not move slowly when dealing with massive wire fraud, international money laundering, and significant flight risks. By 8 o'clock on Sunday morning, a specialized team of federal agents and county sheriffs had arrived at the sprawling colonial estate on Maple Street. My private security team was already there waiting to assist with the legal transition of the property. My parents were forcibly evicted from the only home they had known for 3 decades. They were not allowed to pack up their antique furniture, their expensive art collection, or their vast wardrobes of tailored clothing. Every single item inside that house was now legally considered seized collateral against the fraudulent commercial loan Preston had signed. Desmond and Vivian walked out the front door with nothing but a few hastily packed duffel bags and the clothes they had worn to the disastrous gala. Monique fared even worse in the immediate aftermath. Because she was legally married to Preston and had actively spent the embezzled funds to finance her lavish lifestyle, her entire financial existence was instantly vaporized. The FBI froze all of her personal and joint bank accounts before the sun even rose on Sunday. Federal agents confiscated her designer jewelry, her luxury vehicles, and even the physical cash she had hidden in her personal safe. They treated her $15,000 custom beaded gown as direct evidence of criminal proceeds. The three of them had absolutely nowhere else to go. Their wealthy friends from the exclusive country club completely abandoned them the very moment the news of Preston's arrest broke on the local financial blogs. The same socialites who had gladly drank their imported champagne on Saturday night actively refused to answer their desperate phone calls on Sunday morning. My parents were completely radioactive. They were toxic outcasts in a society that only valued untouchable wealth and pristine status. With their platinum credit cards heavily declined and their cash reserves completely seized, they were forced to pool the few crumpled bills they had left in their wallets just to survive. They rented a single room at a dilapidated roadside motel on the absolute outskirts of the city. My private investigators continued their surveillance and sent me detailed photographs of their new squalid accommodations. It was a dingy, cramped room with peeling yellow wallpaper, stained brown carpeting, and a single flickering fluorescent light bulb that buzzed constantly. Desmond, a man who used to boast endlessly about his bespoke suits and elite corporate connections, sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, staring blankly at a muted television screen. Vivian, the woman who had arrogantly demanded white orchids and crystal chandeliers, was huddled in a cheap plastic chair, weeping uncontrollably into her hands. Monique paced the small space, walking back and forth on the sticky linoleum floor of the motel bathroom, like a caged and terrified animal. She was going through severe psychological withdrawal from her vanished lifestyle. She had no access to her elite salon treatments, her expensive skincare routines, or her wealthy, sycophantic friends. She had to wash her face with a cheap cracked bar of industrial motel soap. She was completely stripped of the unearned superiority and toxic vanity she had wielded against me since childhood. Desmond tried to call his former golf buddies, begging for a small personal loan, but his number had already been blocked by every single person he considered a peer. Vivian tried to contact her elite event planners to see if she could get a partial refund on the gala floral arrangements, but the planners simply laughed at her and hung up the phone. They were truly, utterly alone. Desperation breeds a very specific kind of madness, and by the third day, the reality of their absolute destitution broke whatever remaining pride they possessed. They realized that no one in the world was coming to save them except the daughter they had thrown away. They managed to scrape together enough loose change to hire a cheap, heavily dented cab ride into the city. They did not go to a legal aid clinic or a public homeless shelter. They came directly to me. I had recently relocated my primary residence to a newly purchased hyper-secure penthouse suite occupying the entire top floor of a massive glass residential tower in the heart of downtown Atlanta. It was a sprawling fortress of modern luxury, protected by elite private security teams, biometric retina scanners, and reinforced steel elevator doors. I was sitting in my spacious living room, drinking a cup of dark coffee and looking out over the panoramic view of the city skyline when my private concierge called via the internal secure line. Julian, my concierge informed me that 3 deeply agitated individuals claiming to be my immediate family were causing a severe disturbance in the ground floor lobby. He told me they looked completely unhinged and were desperately begging the security guards to let them up to my private floor. Julian asked if I wanted him to call the local police and have them forcefully removed and arrested for trespassing. I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching the tiny cars moving on the highway far below. I told Julian to hold the police. I instructed him to allow them to wait in the private, secure lobby viewing area and told him I would be right down to handle the situation personally. I walked over to my private glass elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors opened smoothly, and I stepped out into the expansive, towering marble lobby. The space was pristine and silent, decorated with minimalist modern art and bathed in warm, natural sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Standing in the exact center of the immaculate room, looking like absolute garbage, were Vivian Desmond and Monique. The physical transformation they had undergone in just 72 hours was staggering. They looked aged, broken, and entirely defeated. Their clothes were deeply wrinkled and smelled faintly of stale motel smoke. Desmond looked incredibly frail and hollow, without the heavy armor of his expensive tailored suits. Vivian had dark, purple sunken circles under her eyes, and her normally perfect hair was a flat, tangled mess. Monique looked absolutely feral. The moment Monique saw me stepping out of the elevator, she let out a desperate, gasping cry. She broke away from our parents and sprinted across the polished marble floor toward me. 2 massive private security guards wearing dark suits instantly stepped forward, crossing their arms and physically blocking her path. They forced her to stop a few feet away from where I stood. Monique's legs simply gave out. She collapsed onto her knees right there on the pristine, cold marble floor. She began weeping hysterically, the harsh, wet sound echoing loudly through the quiet, elegant lobby. "Cleo, please," she sobbed heavily, her voice cracking with pure, unfiltered desperation. "Please, you have to help us. You have to fix this." Preston is sitting in a cold federal jail cell, and they are completely denying him bail because they say he is a massive flight risk. The government took everything I own, Cleo. My accounts are totally frozen. I do not even have money to buy a coffee or feed myself. Mom and Dad have absolutely nothing left in the world. Their retirement is gone. Their house is gone. We are sleeping in a disgusting, terrifying motel room that smells like mold and rotting garbage. You cannot do this to us. We are your family. We are your blood. I did not move. I just stood perfectly still with my hands resting comfortably in the pockets of my tailored trousers and watched her cry. She reached out her hands, trembling violently in the air between us. Desmond and Vivian stood a few paces behind her. They were too ashamed and thoroughly broken to speak, but their eyes were wide with desperate, silent pleading. My father, who had spent his entire life telling me I was a pathetic disappointment, was now shivering in a luxury lobby, waiting for me to toss him a lifeline. My mother, who had actively burned my college acceptance letters to protect Monique, was staring at me with the terrified eyes of a trapped prey animal. Monique continued to wail, begging me to magically undo the absolute devastation I had meticulously orchestrated. "I know we made mistakes, Cleo," she cried, tears and running mascara streaming down her face and dripping onto the collar of her dirty shirt. "I know we were hard on you when we were growing up, but that was just tough love. We always wanted the best for you. We can fix all of this right now. Just drop the civil lawsuit against us. Sign the legal paperwork to release the federal hold on Preston's firm. Just give us the $60 million from your lottery ticket, and we can all start over together. She was bargaining with a frantic, delusional intensity completely disconnected from the reality of the crimes her husband had committed. We can buy back the Maple Street house, she babbled, her words tumbling over each other in her rush to convince me. We will give you the master bedroom, Cleo. We will treat you like the true head of the family. You can live with us, and we will take care of you. We can use the lottery cash to hire Preston, the absolute best federal defense lawyers in the country. He can get out of jail, and we can all go back to being a real family again. You have the money, Cleo. You have the power to save us. Just give us the money, Cleo, please. I am begging you, please. She bowed her head toward the marble floor, sobbing so hard her shoulders shook violently. Her pleas echoed into silence, leaving only the sound of her ragged breathing in the massive lobby. I stood there looking down at my older sister, kneeling on the floor in her ruined clothes, begging me for salvation. I looked at my mother, who had treated me like a repulsive burden, my entire life now shaking with palpable fear. I looked at my father, who had built his entire identity on dominating others, now waiting helplessly for me to rescue him from the gutter. I felt no anger anymore. The burning rage that had fueled me for months had completely evaporated. I felt no sorrow or pity or residual familial obligation. I felt nothing but absolute cold, total indifference. They were strangers to me. They were a bad memory that I had finally excised from my life. I tilted my head slightly and looked at Monique with perfectly dead eyes. I let the silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment, allowing her desperate sobs to slowly taper off. She looked up at me with red, swollen, bloodshot eyes, desperately waiting for a shred of empathy or forgiveness that simply did not exist inside me. I leaned forward slightly, shifting my weight, and looked at the three of them with a calm, unblinking stare. I spoke in a very quiet, very flat voice that carried effortlessly across the marble floor. You still think there is money left? The silence that followed my question was absolute. It hung in the cold air of the luxury lobby like a physical weight pressing down on their shoulders. Monique stopped crying. She just stared up at me from her knees, her mouth slightly open, her mascara-stained eyes blinking in slow, terrified confusion. Desmond took a shaky step forward, his hands trembling at his sides. "What are you talking about, Cleo?" he demanded, trying to summon his old, authoritative voice, but failing miserably. It sounded weak and hollow. "You won $120 million. We filed the lawsuit. The courts froze the assets. It is sitting in a holding account." I signaled to my private concierge, Julian, who was standing discreetly near the security desk. He immediately walked over, carrying a thick, heavy black leather binder. He handed it to me with a respectful nod and stepped back. I held the heavy binder in my hands, feeling the satisfying weight of their total destruction. I looked at my father, watching the desperate, greedy hope still flickering in his eyes. I held the binder out to him. He hesitated for a second before reaching out and taking it, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. "Open it," I commanded, my voice perfectly calm and even. Desmond fumbled with the metal clasps and flipped the binder open. Vivian crowded in next to him, peering over his shoulder with wide, terrified eyes. Monique slowly pushed herself up off the cold marble floor, leaning against my father's arm to look at the thick stacks of legal documents inside. "Dad, you said the ticket was yours?" I said, watching their eyes dart across the complex legal jargon. "You sat in my cheap apartment and you told me that I was a failure who did not deserve that money. You said you were going to take it from me because I was too stupid to know what to do with it. So I made absolutely sure that neither of us got it." Desmond flipped rapidly through the pages, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. "This is a trust document," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What did you do, Cleo? What is this?" "It is an irrevocable non-profit foundation," I explained, pacing slowly in front of them, my stilettos clicking softly on the marble. The day after I claimed the winning ticket, I completely bypassed standard wealth management firms because I knew exactly what Preston would try to do. Instead, I hired a team of the most ruthless and elite trust lawyers in the country. I instructed them to take $119 million of my winnings and transfer it directly into a fully locked, impenetrable, irrevocable trust. Monique let out a soft whimpering sound, her eyes scanning the summary page. "What does irrevocable mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It means the money is gone, Monique," I said, stopping to look directly into her terrified eyes. "It means it cannot be altered, amended, or revoked by anyone under any circumstances. It means that even I do not have access to the principal. I surrendered all ownership and control of the funds the moment the transfer was executed. The foundation is governed by a strict independent board of directors, and the funds are legally locked away forever." Vivian grabbed Desmond's arm, her fingers digging into his wrinkled shirt. "But the lawsuit," she stammered. "Preston said the lawsuit would freeze the assets and force a settlement. Preston said we were going to get it all back." I laughed, a short, humorless sound that echoed off the high glass walls. "Preston is a monumental idiot," I said coldly. "You cannot freeze assets that do not belong to the defendant." By the time Preston filed his ridiculous, frivolous lawsuit claiming he bought the ticket, the money was already gone. It was already legally transferred to a protected nonprofit entity. "Your lawsuit is currently targeting an empty bank account. You mortgaged your massive paid-off estate to a shadow lender to fund a legal battle for a treasure chest that had already been completely emptied." Desmond's face turned an alarming shade of gray. He gripped the edges of the binder, his knuckles turning white as he stared at the mission statement printed on the first page. "What is this foundation?" he gasped, struggling to draw breath. "What did you do with the money?" I smiled, a deeply satisfied smile. "I thought you would appreciate the profound poetry of the investment," I said. "The foundation is dedicated exclusively to providing elite legal aid and comprehensive financial recovery resources for Black women who are facing domestic and financial abuse. It is a massive, limitless war chest designed specifically to utterly destroy predatory men, exactly like Preston, and controlling arrogant men, exactly like you, Dad. The money you thought you were going to steal to fund your country club lifestyle is currently being used to permanently dismantle the exact systems of power you both worshipped." Monique let out a sharp, agonizing wail, holding her hands over her ears as if trying to physically block out my words. "But you kept some," she cried desperately. "You have to have kept some. Look at this building. Look at your clothes. You are rich, Cleo. You have to help us." "I kept exactly $1 million, I replied, my voice dropping to a flat, indifferent tone. $1 million was just enough to pay the initial tax liabilities, buy this hyper-secure penthouse in cash, and fully fund the startup costs for my own independent forensic accounting firm. My business is already profitable, and my living expenses are minimal. The remaining $119 million is completely untouchable. You can continue to sue me for the next 50 years if you want to. You can drag me into every civil court in the state. But the money is gone. You destroyed your entire lives. You lost your house. You lost your wealth, and your husband is going to federal prison, all for absolutely nothing." The sheer crushing weight of the reality finally broke them. It did not happen slowly. It happened all at once, a total, catastrophic, systemic failure of their shared delusion. Desmond let out a horrible, strangled gasp. The heavy leather binder slipped from his trembling hands and hit the marble floor with a loud, echoing thud. He clutched his chest, his face contorting in sudden, severe agony. He stumbled backward, his legs giving out completely, and collapsed onto the hard stone floor, struggling desperately to breathe as a massive panic attack seized his entire body. Vivian screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. "Desmond!" she shrieked, grabbing his face. "Desmond, look at me. Somebody help him! Please, somebody help him! Monique did not even look at our father. She was entirely consumed by the horrifying realization of her own inescapable future. The reality of her situation hit her with the force of a freight train. Preston was never coming home. The federal government was going to seize every single asset tied to his name to pay restitution to his victims. She had no college degree. She had no marketable skills. She had never worked a single hard day in her entire pampered, privileged life. She had spent 32 years mocking my ambition and relying entirely on the financial success of a criminal. I have to work, Monique whispered, staring blankly at the floor, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. I have to get a job. I do not know how to do anything. They are going to make me work at a grocery store. They are going to make me clean floors. I cannot do it, Cleo. I cannot be poor. I cannot be like those people. She began to hyperventilate, clawing at her own face, her perfectly manicured nails leaving angry red scratches across her cheeks. She fell forward, curling into a tight fetal position on the marble floor, sobbing and screaming in pure, unhinged agony. She was mourning the permanent death of her golden child status. She was mourning the end of the only identity she had ever known. She was crying for the absolute loss of her superiority, because without Preston's stolen money, she was nothing but an empty shell of a human being, facing a lifetime of minimum wage labor just to keep from starving on the streets. Vivian looked up at me from where she knelt beside my gasping father. The arrogance and cruelty that had defined her entire existence had been completely scrubbed away, leaving only a pathetic, terrified old woman. She released Desmond and crawled across the floor toward me. She reached out with her trembling hands, desperately trying to grab the hem of my tailored trousers. "Cleo, please," Vivian begged, her voice cracking and breaking into a pathetic whine. "Please forgive us. We were wrong. We were so wrong about you. You are our daughter. You are my little girl. Please do not leave us like this. We have nothing. We have absolutely nothing. I am so sorry, Cleo. I am so sorry for everything." I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire childhood making sure I felt entirely worthless. The woman who had deliberately sabotaged my future just to ensure my sister remained the sole pride of the family. I looked at the father who was currently gasping for air on the floor, the man who had always told me I was a massive disappointment and tried to steal everything I had. I looked at the sister who was currently screaming in terror at the prospect of having to live like a normal human being and work a real job. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, ensuring that my mother's grasping fingers met only empty air. She fell forward, her hands slapping against the cold marble right where my shoes had just been. I looked down at the three of them writhing and weeping on the floor of my lobby. I felt absolutely no guilt. I felt no lingering attachment. I felt only the profound, pristine silence of complete liberation. My entire life had been defined by their cruelty and my desperate need to escape it. Now they were trapped in a cage of their own making, locked in a prison of poverty and shame that they had eagerly built with their own bare hands. They had tried to bury me, but they had only succeeded in digging their own graves. "Happy birthday to me," I whispered, my voice perfectly calm and totally devoid of any emotion. I turned my back on them and walked slowly toward my private glass elevator. I did not rush. I did not look over my shoulder. I stepped inside the elevator carriage and pressed the button for the penthouse. The heavy, reinforced steel doors began to slide shut. Through the narrowing gap, I watched my toxic family thrashing in the wreckage of their own making. I watched Vivian sobbing into the floor. I watched Desmond clutching his chest, his face purple and wet with tears. I watched Monique screaming at a future she could no longer buy her way out of, tearing her hair and wailing like a banshee. The doors sealed shut with a soft, quiet click, instantly cutting off the sounds of their suffering. The elevator began its smooth, silent ascent, carrying me upward toward my quiet, beautiful, empty penthouse, leaving them trapped in the absolute darkness of their own creation. The ultimate lesson from this story is that true security comes from independence, not from toxic family ties. It teaches us that setting firm boundaries against manipulation and financial abuse isn't cruel. It is absolutely necessary for your survival. When toxic relatives value money and status over authentic love, the most powerful response isn't trying to change them, but walking away to build your own thriving reality. You owe nothing to those who only view you as an asset to exploit. Share your experiences with setting family boundaries in the comments below and hit subscribe for more empowering stories.